All right, welcome back for the last part of our deep dive here. We've gone through a lot with clean architecture. We talked about the big ideas, the techniques, but now I think it's time to see how it all works in the real world and in different situations.
Now let's get specific.
Right. So let's start with the web, because I gotta say, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea that Uncle Bob throws out there about the web just being another I/O device.
I know, right? It's kind of like, whoa, hold on a minute.
It is,
But it really makes you think differently about how we usually approach web development.
for sure.
Because so often we get caught up in all the frameworks, JavaScript, AJAX, all that stuff.
Oh yeah, it's easy to get lost in all that.
And we end up letting those things, the web stuff, dictate how we build our applications.
I've definitely been guilty of that, chasing the shiny new framework.
We all have. But clean architecture, it reminds us to step back and see the web for what it really is. Just a way to deliver our application, to interact with users.
Okay.
But the core logic, the heart of the application, that shouldn't be tangled up with all those web details.
Right. So how do we actually do that? How do we separate those things without ending up with a giant mess?
The key is to treat the web as a boundary, like a layer that sits outside the core of the application. It's like building a bridge, right? Between the world of our business logic and the world of web browsers, user interfaces.
So we're not ditching web frameworks entirely.
No, we can still use them, but we use them strategically. They
Hmm.
become tools to help us build that bridge. We might have, like, a web component that handles things like routing, data formatting, UI stuff.
But that component, it wouldn't be directly messing with the core business logic, right?
Exactly. It's like a middleman translating between the web and our application's core.
I see. I see. And that makes it more flexible, right? Like what if we decide to switch to a different web framework later on?
That's the beauty of it. You can change that without having to rewrite the whole core of your application.
So we're basically making our application more future-proof by separating it from the web stuff.
Exactly. And this same idea, boundaries and plugins, it applies to microservices too. It's a natural fit.
Ah, microservices. Everyone's talking about those.
Right. So at the heart of it, microservices are about breaking down a big application into smaller, independent services. Each service has its own, like, little world, its own data, its own way of being deployed.
That sounds a lot like the modularity and separation of concerns we've been talking about.
Exactly. Each microservice can be like its own little clean architecture, right?
So it's like a bunch of mini clean architectures all working together.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And the boundaries between those microservices, those become really important points of separation.
Right, because then changes in one service won't break everything else.
Exactly. But, Uncle Bob warns against the decoupling fallacy. Just because you're using microservices doesn't automatically mean everything's decoupled.
Right, it's not a magic solution.
Yep. You still need to be careful about how those services communicate, what data they share, all of that.
So it's still about making smart design decisions no matter what architectural style you're using.
Always. Microservices can be great, for scalability, for deploying things independently, but they come with their own challenges too.
And clean architecture can help us navigate those challenges.
Yeah, definitely. It helps us build systems that are robust and can adapt to changes.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and talk about embedded systems. We touched on this with James Grenning, but I'm curious to hear more about how these clean architecture principles apply to, well, embedded systems. Because it's a pretty different world, right?
Oh, it is. It's a fascinating world. Embedded systems have their own unique challenges.
And resource constraints, real-time stuff, all that.
Exactly. But the core ideas of clean architecture, they still apply. Layering, separation of concerns, dependency management, all those things help us build better embedded software. Software that's easier to test, maintain, and even port to different hardware.
One thing that comes to mind is the hardware abstraction layer, the HAL. Can you remind me how that fits in?
Oh, the HAL, that's a brilliant idea. It's like a protective barrier between the software and the hardware, right?
Okay.
It hides all the messy details of the hardware so the software doesn't have to worry about it.
So it's like a translator that lets our software talk to different hardware platforms without getting bogged down in the specifics.
Exactly. Which is really important in the embedded world because hardware changes all the time.
Right. New chips come out, components become obsolete. It's a constantly moving target.
And Grenning, he really emphasized how important testability is, even in embedded systems.
Which seems tricky given the resource limitations.
It can be, but clean architecture helps us create components that we can test in isolation,
Okay.
both on the actual hardware and in simulations.
So by separating the software from the hardware as much as possible, we can test things more thoroughly.
Exactly. We can test the logic, the behavior, without being tied to the physical hardware.
And finally, we got to talk about testing in general. We've touched on it throughout this whole deep dive, but I'd love to hear your final thoughts on how clean architecture helps us build more testable systems.
Testing is crucial, right? No matter what you're building. And clean architecture really sets us up for success in this area.
Also,
Well, because it encourages us to create those loosely coupled modular components with clear interfaces, all the things we've been talking about.
right, it's like giving each part of the system its own little space to shine so we can test it without everything else getting in the way.
Exactly. And remember, testing isn't just about finding bugs, it's about building confidence in our code.
Right, making sure it does what it's supposed to do.
And that any changes we make don't break things unexpectedly.
So it's like a safety net that allows us to move faster and with more confidence.
Exactly. And Uncle Bob, he reminds us that our tests themselves should be treated with the same care as our production code. They should be well-structured, easy to read, and maintainable over time.
No more messy test code then.
No more hacky tests. Our tests are an investment in the long-term health of our systems.
This has been fantastic. We've explored so much about clean architecture, the philosophy, the principles, how to apply it in different situations.
It's been a great deep dive for sure.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how to build software that isn't just functional, but also robust, adaptable, software that can stand the test of time.
And that's really the goal, isn't it? To build systems that can evolve and grow.
Absolutely. So that wraps up our deep dive into clean architecture. We hope you've learned a ton and feel ready to tackle your next software project with a fresh perspective. And remember, clean architecture, it's more than just a set of rules. It's a way of thinking, a mindset that can really level up your coding game. Until next time, happy coding, everyone.